Um, Today's guest will be Sam Salzer. And Sam, so are you already here?
Yes, good to be here.
Amazing, amazing. Great. Thank you for being here. We're getting more and more people connecting. In the meantime, guys, what I want you to do is to we've put up a little poll here. So we're asking you, what is your goal? Why have you connected? So is your goal to become an independent bee consultant? Do you want to get a job as a bee consultant, or you just interested in learning a little bit more about behavioral economics, behavioral science, whatever you call it, behavioral design? So let us know, and we'll try to answer all kind of questions. As you can see, I've prepared a full page of questions for Sam. I guess we won't have the time to go over all of them, but we'll definitely be interested in your questions. So again, as you can see on the slide that I have up right now, in your bottom right corner, there is a Q&A section. So please, already now and throughout the webinar, put in your questions, and I'll have a glance from time to time, and I'll try to squeeze some of your questions into our conversation with Sam. And then, of course, at the end, there will be a Q&A session where we'll try to answer all your questions. So 2 weeks ago, it was Melina Palmer's turn. It was a very interesting conversation that's up on YouTube. You can access it if you haven't seen it. And as I'm looking at the votes, Sam, so we have more people who are interested in becoming independent bee consultants, and then someone interested in just getting a job as a bee consultant. Fine. I guess it's slowly time to start. We are getting some first questions. Thank you so much for that. And so I'll stop sharing my screen now. And well, Sam, thank you so much for being here. You're one of the icons of the field with your Habit Weekly. I'm super interested in knowing a little bit more about your story. I suppose all those who have connected are super interested. So I'll let you introduce yourself. Please tell us who you are, what you do, because I guess most people know you as the face and the name behind Habit Weekly, but that's definitely not all that you do. You're a co-founder of Nuance, but I guess you'll tell us more about your background and how you got into the field. So thanks a lot again for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure. Nice to be here. Hi, everyone. As I said there, I'm in Stockholm, Sweden, and fun thing happened. We have like a snowstorm outside, but I don't know if you heard, but there's this thing that goes around to sell ice cream, and they just passed the building still. So I think it says something about Swedish people that they still sell ice cream when it's a snowstorm. But yeah, so I'm based in Sweden. I am a applied behavioral scientist, behavioral strategist, specializing in really how to put behavioral science to practice and really build good products and services. I think that's kind of where I focused my career. And then along the way, I've done some passion projects. You mentioned Habit Weekly, also Habit Coach Professionals and others, where I just found various ways of looking to better either educate or support behavioral science being a part of the things we do in the world. So very passionate about it and really happy to be here.
Sam, I just right now have your LinkedIn profile open, and it has around 25 experiences, and many of them include the word behavior. So your path through the field has been obviously quite intense and quite interesting. So, but let's start at the beginning. What did you study, and when you were, say, 25 years old? what did you dream of becoming? I suppose it was not really a applied behavioral scientist, was it?
No, in fact, I came from, I would say a single parent household and relatively limited, call it financial circumstances in Sweden. Even though Sweden is a very, I think, wealthy country in many ways, we were kind of on the lower end of that side. So I think growing up, I definitely imagined myself being more of like a entrepreneur or doing something big in business, I think, initially. And for some reason, I decided to travel from Sweden to Australia to study my bachelor initially in finance. And that's kind of where I realized, I guess, two things. First, that, I don't know, making money and some of that stuff, like it felt very hollow. Spending a lot of time with some of the business students at the time, I felt like I couldn't really relate on some grounds, and I felt like it felt a little bit empty. At the same time, I was very fortunate, secondly, through a professor being introduced to behavioral economics. Literally, I was smuggled books. He was like, you should read these books. They're not part of anything we do. They're not part of anything here, but they could be interesting for you in the future. And so devouring those books became like the first step to being interested in understanding human decision-making, habits, all of these things. And, to be honest, at the time, I was really excited to start in some form of applied role afterwards, but I still remember going to Google and basically searching for something like behavioral designer or applied behavioral science or something like this. And Google basically said, like, did you mean botanical designer? Did you mean something else? Because there wasn't really much of a applied side to the field at the time.
And Sam, was this around the year, say, 2005, 7, 8, around that time?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Maybe a little bit later, maybe 2010, 11, 12, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, time flies. But so initially I started more as kind of like still a financial kind of advisory role initially, like in terms of a consultancy in Australia where they had kind of corporate finance advisory roles. And that was very unsatisfying. I have a long beard now. I think the longest beard I've had was because I felt kind of trapped in a very unfulfilling career at that point, and I saved a really long beard. And eventually, after 2 years, I was kind of like able to start taking some real steps through having honestly been doing a lot of things on the side, both connecting with people all around the world, learning a lot on the side, and slowly being able to get into actually the idea of actually doing something more than just learning, but actually maybe applying as well.
Mm-hmm. And so you started by doing some little things on the side of your main full-time job. Was it helping some friends and small businesses to apply some of the behavioral insights, or what were the first steps that you took from the books and the theory to actually putting anything into practice?
Yes, I guess it was like 3 legs. So the first, as you mentioned, was theory, like continuing to learn more about the theoretical side of things. Secondly, was really connecting with practitioners around the world, honestly. At that time, mostly in the US, some in the UK and some other places, and really understanding like, what does the good process look like? Like, how are people applying this stuff in practice? Like, how does someone in the US, in New York versus LA versus London and so on do these things? And can we do something together? Or can I learn with them and so on? And then lastly, like you say, finding any opportunity to either do some form of projects with some people I knew, or help someone who's doing something, or maybe writing something and publishing that. So kind of like learning in public in some ways. So those were the three main legs at that time.
When did you feel comfortable enough to start applying it? When did you feel like, okay, I already know enough to go out there and try to apply something to a real business case?
Yeah, I think that took some time. And I would say, fast forwarding a little bit, eventually I came back to Sweden, and I would say the planning at that point was to basically start the first behavioral consultants in Sweden. Little did I know, 3 months before that, 3 wonderful people had done that thing. And so as I came back and wanted to be the first, I realized I would be the second. And I had like these 2 options, like either I will try to do something by myself, or maybe I can join forces and collaborate. And luckily I did the second. I convinced these 3 lovely individuals, talented, to kind of join missions, because they were basically aligned on all of the things that I wanted to do as well. And I think it was together with them, like having this kind of shared sense of understanding. There were 2 other behavioral economists and 1 service designer among us 4. And kind of together, I think it became easier, because you kind of had that kind of sense of, I don't know, peers and kind of someone where you can really think big and be kind of also vulnerable about things you don't know and understand them, and doing that together. So I think through that process, and also having some diversity in the team, in terms of we had more and more people from different like non-traditional behavioral science backgrounds, and that really helped as well to, I would say, help me better understand, what's the value of behavioral science, what's the limitations, and so on as well. So those years was really, really special.
I'm very interested in your first paid projects and what were the first clients you managed to acquire. But let's postpone that for a second, because maybe you're aware how I want to lead this interview, and that it will be split into parts. But for you guys who are now watching and will watch the recording, so we want to split this conversation into 2 kind of interlinked parts. The first one should be about what makes a good behavioral consultant, and the second one should be about how to become an independent behavioral consultant. So let's leave the client side of things and the acquisition side of things for a little bit later, and let's come back to my previous question, when where I asked about the kind of the fear of starting applying the theory that people are reading in books about into practice. Because I get a lot of people turning to me and asking me, so how did you do it? When did you feel comfortable and confident enough to start applying it? Because I've read 100 books, about behavioral economics, and I still don't know if I know enough. So what would be your advice? So when should people maybe stop reading and start applying?
Yes, I think the key word here is process, basically. So I would say, really, even maybe I'm going ahead of the questions here, but if I really separate like what is a average or poor behavioral consultant versus a really good one, I think the key thing is if they have a good process or not. Like, do you have a really solid understanding of understanding what it takes from, going from the beginning of a project where you're maybe trying to get some form of problem, understanding, setting up that context, really getting that kind of understanding of what's the lay of the land, the user insights, and then starting to get towards, taking step by step into designing intervention and testing that and so on. Like, that kind of process takes time to be really confident in. And I think even however long time you spend reading books, there are some books about the process, like Designing for Behavior Change by Steve Wendell. Matt Wallert has a book about some of these things as well. There are books about more process-oriented things, but at the same time, I think that's where the confidence come in. When you kind of initially, I wouldn't expect you to run that whole process. You would probably kind of like one part of that process, maybe as helping with the user research, maybe as helping with like designing intervention, maybe X, Y, and Z. That's probably more likely. However, you technically could go from the first to the last part of that process, and you could technically do that in the most like simple ways possible. Like, if you have a full-time job, you can currently go into more behavioral science. If you just want to run your own experiment about like how to get people to drink more water in the office than something else, like, or less coffee, or whatever it is that people in the office wants to change, you could technically go through all of those steps and kind of get into that process of like understanding the context, literature reviews, interviews, co-creation, and then going to intervention and testing and experimenting. So there's nothing really stopping you from getting through and getting those reps of getting through that process, because that's really where I think you get confidence from, is going through that over and over again.
And I think you're making a very, very important point here, which is very often overlooked, because in my experience, behavioral science, behavioral economics, whatever you call it, behavioral design is very often reduced to behavioral principles. And what I came to believe is that it's much less about the behavioral principles, and it's much more about a way of thinking about the customers, the users, basically the process. What are your thoughts on that? Because, and I'll just finish my question. So I think that you might be a decent behavioral consultant, a behavioral designer, whatever, even without knowing any of the principles, if you think about the customer in the right way. If you, don't just reduce your thinking to motivation. How do I motivate the client or the customer? But you start focusing on the barriers, on the psychological barriers, removing the barriers, asking the right question, conducting research in the right way. So what are your thoughts on that? So principles against versus process and a way of thinking about people.
Yeah, great question. And I can maybe be a bit vulnerable here in terms of so recently, me and a colleague, Roos, we wrote an article called Think Outside the Bias, basically talking about kind of an evolved sense of thinking about cognitive bias within applied behavioral science and product design. And I will admit that if you reverse the clock and you see me speaking, I guess it was let's say 6-7 years ago in Sweden, kind of early days, a lot of my talk was about cognitive biases. I think a lot of kind of initial advocacy when it comes to trying to sell behavioral science or communicate behavioral science, we found a really good story when it came to kind of the idea of we're not fully rational in some ways. Here are some tendencies, some biases, and here are some fun examples of that. That makes for a pretty good storytelling. And the article is not about kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but it's basically trying to say that, yeah, some of these concepts, some of these principles, some of these things can only take you so far. And obsessing about long list of them and memorizing those, or creating these kind of psychology checklists of here are the 150 biases, let's check them off one by one. That's not really the way to good behavioral design. So we talk about in the article what are the ways, and I think a lot of it comes down to thoughtfully using it, but especially coming into the idea of, again, process when it comes to understanding the context. So really starting with really doing some good user research, and that kind of leads the way, and combined with some form of mix of experience and theoretical expertise, you can kind of come with your unique lens as a behavioral scientist and provide a lot of value without ever talking about biases and without ever really getting into that, for example. So yeah, I fully agree.
Mm-hmm. Putting ourselves in the shoes of our listeners and people who are actually interested in becoming behavioral consultants, independent behavioral consultants, I think this is one of the most important advice or things that you'll hear in these webinars. So my advice, and I guess we agree on this, would be not to overly focus on the behavioral principles. And a question very much linked to this is, to what extent, Sam, do you think you need a degree, a master's or bachelor's in behavioral something in order to become a really top behavioral consultant?
Yeah, so I guess it all depends on what your goal is, and also kind of what you feel like your limitations are. Because I think everyone is pretty much on board with some of the things I'll say. I hope it's not controversial, but basically, doing a degree, especially like a applied behavioral science master or something similar, or, going beyond that and doing more of a, let's say, PhD in some ways, any type of academic training can only take you so far in the applied world, and it is quite different. I think there are some examples where I think they've done a decent job in trying to bridge this gap, but at the same time, it's quite a different world. Honestly, I think people underestimate the difference between academia and applied behavioral science. It actually is quite significant. And maybe the controversial thing to say here is that if you wanted to become a really good applied behavioral scientist, master's, but maybe more like special, like let's say a PhD, could actually make you a worse applied behavioral scientist in the sense that like you're training to approach problems in a very different way than what you need to do in an applied setting. In an applied setting versus a PhD setting, very different ways of trying to kind of answer the same type of problems or kind of make sense of the same type of challenges. Requires very different skill sets, requiring very different types of kind of like process and so on. So that's kind of an honest take. And then in terms of like what you're missing, the biggest value probably for some form of master is the credentials in many ways, in that there is a huge problem, I would say, still within the field, in that like the buyers of behavioral science are very poorly educated. They don't really know what to ask for. So if an organization wants behavioral science, they don't really know what it looks like. And so they're very quick to add then like a master as a requirement to this. And I think it follows the line of a lot of these like funny job applications you might have seen of like programming jobs where it requires like 5 years of skill in a programming language that have only been around for like 3 years. And I think it's a little bit similar here when it comes to some of these credentials. And I think, the best thing you can get from many of those programs is kind of a combination of the credentials and the networking. If you're just looking to learn, and if you look like to become like learning to become better, that's probably not the most efficient, cheap, and kind of direct way to get there. And so depends a little bit what you're looking to do. Many good reasons to do it, but also there's good reasons to maybe also not do it, depending on what you're kind of looking to solve for. Yeah.
And I suppose you are an example of a successful B consultant who doesn't have a degree in behavioral science. So am I. I think Melina from 2 weeks ago, she actually has a degree, but also Torben, whom I'll talk with in 2 weeks' time. But I just know so many people who have not studied to become behavioral scientists. And I came to realize that I should avoid the word scientist, because it scares many customers off. Many companies, they're not really looking, in my experience, for behavioral science. They're actually looking to solve some kind of problem, and very often they perceive that there is a kind of a big barrier between science and practice. So, and I think this is one of the biggest mistakes I see kind of aspiring consultants, but also kind of those who come from the academic field make. And the mistake is that they overly focus on the scientific part of it. Because at the end of the day, at least in my experience, and we work with the largest banks, insurers, telcos across Europe, they don't really care if you've used social proof or you've used loss aversion, if you actually managed to solve the problem they were trying to solve. So what's your experience on that? And I will complement the question. What are, in your opinion, one or two mistakes that you see people from academia make as they try to get into the field of applied behavioral economics or applied behavioral science?
Yeah, so I would basically say that, well, first, I think it's good to separate the idea of like that science is, as I said, like a little bit of a tricky one, because I think it's also tricky because you can follow a really good scientific process without, again, going through and learning that through academia. And I would actually kind of echo some of the things you said. I think it's interesting, like a lot of the people that I have over the years kind of in practice seen as like following the best applied behavioral science process, like really doing the science process in practice really well, are not the people that are always the masters or the PhD people. I think you can have a really, how do you say, humility and respect for a good scientific process without having learned that fully through kind of doing a PhD.
Mhm.
So just want that to be said. And then in terms of the mistakes, which I can relate to as well, probably is it's very tempting when trying to kind of like selling behavioral science, obviously, to use certain type of wording and jargon and so on. But at the same time, I think the biggest reminder that we should have as all applied behavioral scientists is like, use behavioral science to teach behavioral science, or use behavioral science to communicate behavioral science. Like it's really this kind of humility exercise to be like, well, I say that I'm a behavioral scientist, but you can't read from my presentation slides. Like, how does that work? Like, how how does some of those things, like, okay, I'm selling a behavioral science course, but it's about friction, but like it takes 25 steps to sign up for the course. Like, it's like, I'm not saying that's actually has happened exactly those examples, but there's been a lot of these kind of like things where we can all kind of forget about like really applying some of the things that we talk about, that we really celebrate in theory, but then we also have to live up to when we communicate and so on. And so really kind of learning to kind of move away from the jargon, move closer to understanding how the clients speak, or the kind of the people who we're working with is speaking, I think is really, really important.
One other mistake I made when I was just starting out 8 years ago, and what I see many people, especially from academia, make, and this is a little bit controversial, so I'm wondering what your opinion would be. I think besides an overly focusing on the scientific part, I think people are also overly focusing on ethics. Because in my opinion, well, the same ethical principles should apply to any marketeer as they should apply to any behavioral scientist. But when it comes to marketing, no one talks about ethics. And when it comes to behavioral economics, behavioral design, and so on, the first thing that you're asked about, the first thing that you hear people talk about is ethics, and how ethics is super important, and so on. And I think this is, at least in my experience, it has been another barrier that stands in the way of actually getting clients and getting business, because you scare companies off. At least I've seen that happen, that when you have a kind of an aspiring consultant, the first thing they say is that they use the word science 15 times in their presentation, and then they spend 15 minutes talking about ethics. Well, it becomes scary for the potential client. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I haven't maybe kind of experienced some of those things too much in terms of like people being too scared off, but I see what you're coming from. And I think, basically, I think what's maybe been done better in, call it, the design world, like design thinking and so on, is, basically when they say human-centered, it's a different word for ethics in some ways. It's kind of like really leading with the idea that, we're doing things with a really good human-centered understanding of what our users are struggling with, or need, or want, and understanding them, and really fighting for them, and really trying to support them. So I think you can kind of like say the same message, but maybe frame it differently. I think in the design kind of side of things, I think they do maybe a better job of like not so much just waving the ethics flag for the sake of it, but more like why, what's the way they're doing so, and how does it matter. So I think they've done a good job in that sense.
Let's Sam wrap up this first part with one or two more questions. And what I'm wondering about, and this is especially important for the aspiring consultants, focus or being a generalist. Because I think later on, as you become more and more kind of established, focusing more might be an advantage. And we've seen that at MindWorks. But at the beginning, what would be your advice to aspiring consultants? Should they try to find their niche, or should they try to get insights and knowledge that's as broad as possible?
Yeah, here I'll probably speak from my personal experience where I kind of initially, didn't really know what my most passionate area of behavioral science was, honestly. I think there were some inclinations that you could have seen early on looking towards like digital health, for example. There's a reason why I probably ended up there today. But I really appreciated, like I was lucky in that sense when we had this first behavioral agency in Sweden, we kind of took any project we could get, like in terms of, whether that was more like in recycling or in health or X, Y, and Z, whatever they were looking to get like a behavioral science lens, we were kind of quite eager to wanting to see if we can help with that. Probably some form of like uh, blissful ignorance in some ways about how little we knew in some ways at that time as well. But I do think that being kind of exposed to some of these like very, very different types of challenges and very different types of contexts and settings, it helped, I think, me better understand kind of what I find interesting, what I'm good at, what I'm kind of less good at, and so on. So I don't think it's a bad thing to be a generalist in the early days and kind of doing kind of a little bit of that, kind of like being open-minded to testing different things. And you can kind of like oftentimes combine things in a way where you kind of like specialized in one thing, but more generalized in a way where you kind of like create overlapping skill sets. So for example, like maybe you have maybe more generalized understanding of behavioral science, but you're really good, I don't know, let's say a product manager, for example, as well. That's not a bad combo. Like you can get quite far with something like that as well, and you can do kind of put to work a lot of behavioral science kind of coming from that way as well. So yeah, I do think there's a lot of value in kind of, especially in the messiness of behavioral science, to kind of start building your niche over time. But I don't know if you need to rush to get there. Yeah.
And you're making a similar point as Melina 2 weeks ago, because and I think it also depends what your previous career has been. Because if you're an expert in, say, digital marketing, or as you're saying, a product person, or you name it, you come from the healthcare sector, you have a very interesting basis on which you can build to create your niche. But for example, in my case, I had absolutely no background on which I could build, no prior experience. So I became a generalist, and over the years, I've actually came to understand what I'm good at, what's interesting for us as a team, where we feel comfortable, and we think we can bring some value. But it took us a couple of years to actually figure that out, to figure out that, well, yes, at the core, it is the same behavioral science, but if you apply it to retail, or you apply it to product design, or you apply it to make people with diabetes change their lifestyle, it is actually very different, even though at the core you have the same principle. So I mean, I
Yeah.
believe that you cannot be a brilliant consultant in everything, and at some point you have to make your choices. But at the beginning, I tend to agree that no rush there. Just explore and see where there is traction also from clients.
Yeah, and for example here, so currently I have been involved with one project that is digital health within treating dementia and brain health. One project that is about uh, other preventative health, and one that's about kind of supporting diabetes. Like if you squint, they look very similar because they're all digital, they're all health, but honestly, each of them requires a very different approach. And I think that's kind of like what I going back to before, in that you kind of, if you want to be really, really good, I think as a applied behavioral practitioner or consultant, you just kind of like have to embrace that idea of like you kind of start always with a bit of a clean slate, where you have to kind of be humble to the context of, even if I do like one diabetic prevention or treatment app, and then I work with another team doing the exact same thing, they might have a different type of app architecture. They might have a different type of, geolocation of users and X, Y. Like there could be so many different variables that requires a completely different way of really approaching that project. And so I think that's kind of also why I just want to flag that however much you specialize, it's an illusion to think you're going to kind of like come to this enlightened place where you don't have to do the hard stuff of like going back to the kind of literature review and drawing board and user insights and all this stuff. You always have to still do those things. And I think honestly that's also what makes it fun. Like it kind of what makes it less likely to be boring, because you always have this kind of like new opportunities to test yourself and learn.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love that. We have a couple of questions here already, and one someone is asking you about the intersection of AI and behavioral science, because I know that lately it's been kind of your thing, and I've actually mentioned you to one of our banking clients because they were asking about they want to do something at the intersection of exactly AI, communication to clients, and behavioral science. So I thought, well, I know someone from Sweden who's actually focusing on that. So tell us a little bit more about this new niche that I think you are creating for yourself. So what is this AI and behavioral science?
Well, I think it was a little bit like in the sense where, it's strange to say that it was about just a year ago when ChatGPT was launched, been a wild year in terms of some of the developments in AI since then. But if you go back, I think maybe 1 or 2 years further, like 1.5 years further, that's when, for example, OpenAI launched their GPT-3 model. And I was involved with some projects to kind of start using that in some ways. And I also started to kind of like play around myself, literally in the playground, as it was called before ChatGPT. It was called the playground, and using some of these things. Had done some more kind of non-language model-based AI stuff even before that in medical interventions. So more kind of this old school AI in terms of like the more like data heavy and analytical structured way. But yeah, I was lucky to be exposed to the language models relatively early, about 3 years ago. And yeah, it's I think today it's part of my work. Certainly some of my projects is using some of that, but even though we're doing some great exciting things there, I would still say that like AI is not like some form of panacea to creating a great product easily or in an instant, or like you basically have the same problems, the same challenges, and in some ways even more challenges when you try to involve AI. And so yeah, I think it's really worth getting into. I still think it's very much early days in terms of some of these applications, and spending some weekends on ChatGPT is a good start, just to kind of like start understanding how they communicate, and then maybe starting to use an API yourself. Like you can set up a lot of things with an API yourself and build things. That's what I did as well. And yeah, I don't know what more to say. I think it's still basically like early days for these use cases. And also it's early days for knowing exactly how we're going to engage with some of these things. Like it's early days to know, where are we going to engage with AI? Most of the things that I do is very subtle things, like where it's kind of improving things or generating things along the way. And we'll see the kind of the usage of, let's say, ChatGPT, this continues to grow, and who knows if we will have the same behavior patterns on Google and other places as before. So there's a lot of unknowns basically, but I would really recommend getting into it. There's a really lovely community called Behavior Bites that have a weekly help start, which kind of covers some of these things. So behaviorbites.ai, if you want to check it out. So that's a good community for behavioral science and AI. That's
perfect. Then we'll include that link in the follow-up email after the webinar. And there is a follow-up question, actually. Can you give a specific example of how you use AI to solve a behavioral problem, if you even use AI to solve behavioral problems?
Yeah, in some ways, you know, it's I have some presentation where I go into a little more this in detail of, like, for example, with my literature review, how I'm doing that very differently today because of AI. So I wish it was something like I come to the altar of ChatGPT and I say, here's the problem, please solve it for me. It doesn't really happen like that. More so, like, it happens like in small sections across the project. So, for example, when doing literature reviews, I'm relying more and more so on things like Research Rabbit, Elicit, some AI-based tools. Maybe when doing some ideations, I might do that. Maybe when creating some, let's say, personalized content for a user journey, I might use AI. So the examples can look very, very different. And it's more something where you kind of like, you start applying it to a specific area of the process rather than trying to kind of like, give away the process. I think Laura de Moliere, she's going to be part of this as well, like this speaker sequence of speakers. Laura de Moliere, or is
No, she's not. She's
no.
not. No, we
Okay.
only have 4 people.
Okay, yeah. So maybe I mixed it up. So she's someone to check out in terms of, like, I think she has a YouTube video. We created a shared presentation on this that I think is on YouTube. So yeah, I would check out maybe some of that stuff if you want to get more examples. Yeah.
Perfect. Great, thanks. Sam, thinking back about your early days, when you joined these 3 individuals in the first behavioral consultancy in Sweden, how did you go about your marketing? How did you get your first clients? What was your first paid project?
Yeah, I think it was a lot of this kind of basic idea of taking, like, if I take the farming metaphor, like, in order to harvest, we had to, like, plow the fields, put in the seeds, like all this stuff. Like, there was no one that came to us and be like, hey, give us behavioral science. Like, we really had to work for it. So I think it was a combination of doing a lot of public speaking, a lot of kind of trainings, workshop, kind of educating the buyers, building relationships. I think that always worked much better than, while obviously you can do things online. Of course it works. Of course you can get help through publishing things. I do think, going back to one of my recommendations about learning in public, I do think that for me, I basically got my first role from writing this quite in-depth review of some of the popular behavioral models at the time, from a very, very simple vantage point. So basically, like, imagining I'm writing this for my sister and making it interesting for her and explaining kind of some of these common behavioral models that will be useful for her. That led to, I think, my first and maybe also my second paid project, because they can kind of like see that I knew what I was talking about, because I can both talk about it but also explain it to a level where they understood it. So I think some of that stuff is really valuable, rather than kind of too much like these kind of only social media or only newsletters or only that stuff. I think really getting into those stuff is really valuable as
And
well.
the same thing has worked for us. And I think you're making the same point as Melina 2 weeks ago. So
Okay.
getting your face out there and talking about your topics, maybe your kind of niche, but in a way that people can understand how they can apply it in practice. And you've also touched on training and education, educating people in the topic. Because I don't know if you've ever tried to track back your clients and where the most of your revenue came from or comes from. But we did it once about 2 years ago, and we figured out that 65% of all our revenue can be tracked back to something we call consumer psychology school. It was a full day open training where companies could just buy a seat or two and attend. And that's where we met most of our clients in the early days, in the first 3, 4, 5 years. And still we having some very interesting collaborations built on the back of these training sessions. So do you still do training, and is it also proving to be an effective way to get new leads?
So I think there's again, like, no doubt that training can be both beneficial in some ways and also profitable in many ways, because it's kind of like, if you remove behavioral science from the map, people have a budget for training. Organizations kind of have dedicated people that are looking to bring in training or upskill and X, Y, and Z. And so there's already that demand. So you don't really have to kind of create some form of service that doesn't exist. You can obviously get in there. So that's the benefit. I would say personally, I think it's a little bit unsatisfying in that, like, I know, for example, for me, habits is kind of one of my key areas of expertise. And I know that habits take time to build, and long-term change to really stick, takes time. You don't get there in a day. And I think personally for me, it always left a little bit of like this sense of unsatisfying feeling, knowing that, like, however good I do my one-day training, the next day people will go back to their work, probably do very much the same thing as they did before. Maybe they'll feel inspired, maybe they'll be motivated to learn more. Of course, can be a good thing that they take from that one-day training, but certainly it's not like, it's not going to completely change the way they work. And so that's why I kind of like personally chose to be more of this kind of long-term advisory role, because I really love seeing this kind of like thing actually change and happen in kind of take hold over time. But yeah, I would also say that I don't want to like say that in a way to kind of discourage people from doing public speaking or training. I think it's really valuable to educate still. And also I would say, I think there were some of these questions that you sent over where it was about kind of a little bit of like, if I ever felt imposter syndrome or some of those things. And I can say that, like, it's really scary to stand in front of people initially and speak and kind of provide expertise. I actually, during that early days in kind of growing the field, that was actually the time I sought like psychological help. I went to psychologists because I had panic attacks from basically feeling imposter syndrome, like basically feeling like I wasn't really sure whether I was kind of had the expertise and really, did things well, and kind of building that confidence. I think also, I don't remember who was, Adam Grant maybe spoke to this recently, of like, he had like shaking his hands, like his hands were shaking every time, the first times he was speaking. And there's no really quick way to get through that other than doing it, is what I've basically found. And so building confidence as a practitioner is basically a little bit of like this kind of like walking through fire in some ways. There are ways to make it nice for yourself, but at the same time, you kind of have to put yourself out there and through this process kind of feel dissatisfied in some ways, feeling like you can do more, feeling like you can do better, but kind of also feeling like, actually, I was able to answer all the questions I received. I get really good kind of feedback. I actually, the people wanted to come have me back for a second time. So like, maybe I'm doing something right as well. So I think that kind of stuff is what worked for me when it came to kind of like overcoming this anxiety to build confidence. It's just basically kind of doing it and showing to myself that I can do it. Yeah.
And I think this is the path to also becoming a really good consultant, because once people, start asking you questions and, asking you to show them how they can apply it in their own case, that's what makes you think about the real world applications that you haven't maybe thought of before. And only when you try to explain the concepts and the applications to someone else, you actually understand it properly. And it's definitely not easy to put together a good training course. I mean, it's difficult as hell, and it took us years and years and years. But it actually, to this day, it's very often a door opener for those long-term collaborations, long-term advisory that you mentioned, that are satisfying, that actually bring about the change. Because and this is really going deep into the business side of things, but as you mentioned, there are training budgets, and it's much easier to sell 1, 2, 3-day training course rather than consulting. But once people pay to listen to you for a whole day, then they are convinced that they want to do business with you because they get to like you, they get to understand that, well, okay, what Sam is saying is actually really valuable, and he's a nice guy, and I can imagine working with him for months to come. So this is, whenever people ask me, so what is the one thing I should do to start building my revenue stream and to get first clients, I always tell them, try to just organize a couple of training programs, training sessions, make them paid, and invite as many companies as possible to attend it, because they will pay to listen to you, and it's the best possible advertising and the best possible marketing you can make. You agree with that?
Basically, I think it's probably true. Yeah.
But I suppose in your case, it has always
yeah.
also been Habit Weekly, right? Because you've started in, what was it, 2018 and 19?
18, yeah.
18. And I suppose it must have been kind of a big boost to your credibility, to your recognition of your name, your brand. Do you get many clients and business leads from Habit Weekly?
Yeah, Habit Weekly has been an interesting journey. I began it more as a way to kind of create what I wish existed, honestly. I felt really overwhelmed at the time, where it was so hard to keep up with what's happening in the field. And I basically figured that, first of all, if I feel it, other people probably feel it too. Secondly, there is a UX weekly, there's a product weekly, there's an XY weekly. Maybe it can be like a habit or behavior weekly, basically. And so I started as kind of an experiment, and also like trying to kind of just create some value in the field. I would definitely say I benefited from it in terms of credibility or kind of top of mind initially. I guess interestingly, the last 2 years or so, Habit Weekly has become much more than me, and so now don't really have my name attached to it in many ways. It's much more of a team effort. So I think some people today might not know that I'm kind of the founder and so on the same way, because Habit Weekly is kind of grew into something much more than what I initially started. And so that's a beautiful thing in itself, because I've had a chance to collaborate and create what Habit Weekly is today with some really great people around the world. So yeah, but it's definitely been a really valuable thing as well in terms of you staying on top of things. It's been like the ultimate commitment device to kind of every week stay on top of what's happening, that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's been good.
I think one of the biggest fears and barriers for aspiring consultants is this lack of credibility. And you've managed to build your credibility, doing many things, speaking, writing about it, creating Habit Weekly, and now you're one of the best known names in the field, I would say. There's also what a friend of mine calls credibility by association. And that's what we did. In the early days, we came up with this idea of behavioral economics and consumer psychology marketing masterclass, where we reached out to Dan Ariely and Rory Sutherland, and we created an online course with them. And that's what helped us to get an international credibility. And that's the moment that actually put us on the world map of behavioral economics. And Sam, we are now going to open it for Q&A, because we have quite a few questions in already here. But before we go to the questions, I just want to share one slide, this is for all of you guys who are interested in becoming independent consultants. Check out this link, because this is something that we just launched 2 weeks ago, and this is basically an opportunity for those who dream of becoming independent consultants to associate with us, to actually take advantage of all the experience that we've gained over the years and the credibility that we have in the field by becoming licensed partners of Mindworks. So everything is explained there. Have a look. It can actually be quite interesting, I suppose. All right, so now, Sam, let me check the questions we've received. There are quite a few of them. Uh, so let's start here. Okay, so many good points. One of which clients don't want behavioral science; they want a solution to their problem. So how do you acquire customers? How do they come to you? We've partially answered that, but now in say in Nuance or in your consultancy, um,
Yeah.
what are the 2 or 3 main sources of new business leads or new clients?
Uh, well, I try to answer the question in terms of like, so I agree in terms of like people want to solve the problem. I think people are increasingly seeing that there are potentials to require a different perspective to solve certain problems, and that the behavioral science perspective can be valuable. But again, you have to kind of like showcase how that works. So like for us, for Nuance behavior, we would really focus on, again, speaking the language of digital product teams and understanding kind of like, okay, what are the main things that they're struggling with, and showcasing kind of like, here is how behavioral science can help to make your life easier and your products more effective and so on. And not also like pretending it that it's a form of like magic wand, but really that it's just a useful lens, as maybe some people would say, to kind of add to things. But yeah, I think a lot of it comes from like really building relationships. Honestly, I think over time, really showing that you're someone that wants to listen and wants to understand what the problem they're looking to solve is, and then kind of have that ability to kind of frame how you can solve that in your kind of behavioral terms. I think that's a really useful skill that takes time to develop, but I think that's basically what
And
I try to do
but
every day.
how do
Yeah.
you build those relationships? Where do you go? Where do you meet those potential clients, and how do you maintain those meaningful, say, conversations or relationships that you're talking about?
Yeah, so again, I think here I'm a little bit lucky in that like I think a lot of people reach out to me because they maybe listen to the behavioral design podcast,
Mhm.
or maybe they've seen me on LinkedIn, or you know, I've been very lucky since I became independent advisor about 4 years ago, in that I never had to look myself for things. Like either it's become from past client work that's been recommended to me, or people have been exposed to my work in some ways and wanted to have a chat and learn more. So I think basically the short answer in some ways is like I put myself out there in many different ways, hoping that kind of some people would kind of what do you call it, catch the hook, the bite, whatever, and then kind of coming from it that way. I think in general, obviously, that is the optimal way if you can choose, where kind of like people come to you with some level of curiosity instead of like you having to start with coming to them and being like, hey, let me tell you in an elevator pitch why you should care about behavioral science. Like it's really hard. So it's better to kind of like find ways where you can spark creativity or curiosity within kind of something you've created, and then they coming to learn more. Yeah.
And I think this is a very, very important point because I haven't met behavioral consultant and in general consultants who make their living and acquire clients by doing cold calls. It's very difficult. It's very time consuming and it's very frustrating. And what has worked for us, and we're a team of 6, and well, I mean, I suppose you're also booked out for months ahead, and we're in a similar situation. And the way we do it is that we provide value, this for us has, I mean, a big game changer has been last year when we created a new business strategy with a clear focus on specific industries and specific, say, products, or types of advisory. And since we were able to do very targeted and meaningful events, webinars, business breakfasts, and so on, where we attract people and they come to get value. And once we're able to give them value, then the conversations are so much easier. So, and this is also my advice for anybody whoever asks me. So go out there and give meaningful value. And meaningful value is not about explaining the anchoring bias. No, it's definitely not about it, because you can read about it in any kind of article, or you just ask ChatGPT. But showing people how to use anchoring in say a business conversation, in a price negotiations, in whatever, on a website, this is meaningful value. So it's actually the applications of it, and that was one of Melina's points 2 weeks ago also. So talk and think and write about how all these principles can be applied, not just explaining the theory, but how they can actually be applied. Another question, Sam. There was at the beginning of our conversation, someone asked about the scandals with Ariely, for instance, and how they might be affecting the reputation of the field and the trustworthiness of everything that's been done in the field. So what is your thought on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I can answer in two ways. Like, I think one part is, has it changed the way I work, for example, some of these recent developments. And I guess that's maybe where some people think differently in terms of what they expect. But there's very little changes in like how I do my work since the recent Gino and Ariely cases happened, even some of the earlier ones in the past as well, because honestly, like I no offense to them, but I never ended up using any of their research specifically. Like it's kind of a very small, if you look at it, if you step back, what they've contributed is a real contribution to the field in terms of sightings and so on. But it's very niche and very small in terms of like the bigger understanding of human behavior. So going back to the process, going back to kind of understanding kind of the more kind of foundational things and real call it first principles of behavioral science hasn't really changed much at all. And I wasn't honestly super surprised in some ways about some of the developments in terms of, the findings and also then what's kind of unraveled. From the perspective of the question when it comes to like, how do I communicate this to clients and so on? Honestly, it hasn't been much of a conversation so far. Most clients haven't been really kind of aware of what's happened in some ways. And if they did, I would probably kind of explain or try to provide it in context of what's happened and who's done what and so on. That being said, I know that, of course, if you have the likes of, New York Times or, all of this big BuzzFeed writing about this stuff, like, sadly does create a blemish of the field of behavioral science. And I think that's the sad part where you kind of like hope that it doesn't fully kind of create this throwing out the baby with the bathwater effect by some people thinking like, okay, behavioral science is all good or all bad, or, this kind of stuff. And yeah, I can talk about this for a long time. You can certainly think like, it's very also tempting to say like, okay, it's not a true Scotsman fallacy kind of thing where like they were not true behavioral scientists, or like they were not true, like, or like there's a few bad apples and so on. I think there's still some good arguments for where there should probably be a little bit more soul searching within the field than that, to say that there are important things that we can learn from not only this, but like a history of some of these things unraveling in the last two decades or so. And as applied practitioners, I think, it's in some ways, doesn't make it less valuable to do literature reviews. It's still really valuable. At the same time, it maybe leads you to hopefully spend a little more time in really not blindly trusting literature reviews. And I think that's partly part of the process problem within academia in some ways, from my point of view, is that like you go from problem to solution mostly within, the literature, and then designing intervention based on literature, and then running the experiment without actually meeting users, without actually doing usability testing, without doing co-creation, without doing a lot of stuff that you can do along the way that can really give you much, much better understanding than just literature reviews could, or just collecting certain data points could. So I think it behooves us as applied behavioral scientists to really, try to get this kind of like qualitative, quantitative, attitudinal, behavioral data, like try to collect a really holistic understanding of the problem and really going from there rather than, trusting too much on specific limited research findings. Yeah.
And I think it's
and that's always been the
amazing.
case. It's always been kind of like, sorry for ranting. Just gonna say one thing. This is kind of been the thing hidden in plain sight of like, we're so context dependent in our field. Like it's so context dependent. Small research studies like the one that in some ways Gino and Aurelia has been doing, where it's been, students in universities taking part. How much could we ever assume to extrapolate from those things? Like we should always kind of assume that that context is probably quite different from whatever context we're in ourselves.
Yeah.
Sorry
Use
for the
science as inspiration, not as the holy grail that you just copy and paste to all kind of problems. And I think it's also a great argument for testing. I think that's often overlooked, but you can never be sure from behind a desk, if it's principle 1, 2, or 3, or your hypothesis 1, 2, or 3 that will work best. So you should go out and test. I know we're 6 minutes over time, but Sam, do you have time for one more question?
Okay, final question.
Perfect. There's one question that arrived just 2 minutes ago. What about people who want to start applying behavioral science, but they're based in countries where behavioral science is not a big deal yet? Is it more of an advantage or more of a disadvantage?
Yes, it's both. I would say I can relate to that. Obviously, Sweden, behavioral science hasn't been a big thing. I was lucky to literally be having an office. Like our office was next to where they had part of the Nobel Prize ceremonies, and I remember the day when it was announced that Thaler won, Nobel Prize, and everyone in Sweden certainly over day went more interested into kind of understanding behavioral science and what is like nudging, and suddenly like news reporters were contacting us and be like, hey, tell us about this thing. So that was lucky in some ways, and I think that helped to create interest. But yeah, I do think that it is a little bit of both. The good news is that there's so many people who's gone through those kind of journeys. Hopefully, maybe I've shared some things today that's been useful. But you speak about Torben, he's gone through a similar journey in Switzerland. You also gone through a similar journey, and there's so many people who are kind of across Europe, across Asia, increasingly across South America, Africa, that are kind of taking these, kind of having gone through these journeys and can probably share some insights. So I think there's a lot of different inspiration and connection that could be made within kind of learning from others there. So while you feel alone in your country, maybe don't feel alone as a community. Like there's a lot of people in the community that you can probably learn from. Yeah.
And at least two of us, we're very much willing to share our experience and help you out, guys, with starting your behavioral practices. And my last thought would be, don't be afraid of competition, because there's just so much potential out there, and the number of truly good behavioral consultants is just so small that the market is absolutely not oversaturated. So good luck. And don't get yourself discouraged from becoming a behavioral consultant. I think it's a fascinating journey. And Sam, it has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for finding the time, and have a good evening to Sweden. Hope to speak to you again soon. Take care, man.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I would say as the last thing, collaboration. It's also really, I think, underrated. Like really, so many opportunities to collaborate. Like in this case, you and I. But I think that's honestly the main thing that I'm very fortunate of, is having been fortunate to work with so many different people, different places around the world, and collaborated on so many different projects. I think that's what really made me the best, of what I am currently, is really collaboration. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Good night, everyone. Really lovely to see you, Matesh.
Where can people find you, Sam? One last thing.
Yeah, maybe like I have a website, so samuelsalzer.com. We have an agency website, nuancebehavior.com, haveaweekly.com. Yeah.
We'll share all of that in the follow-up email.
Yeah. But really good luck, everyone. Really hope this was useful and helpful, and wish you all the best.
Take good care, everybody. Good night, good day, good morning, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Bye.